Imagine a world where royal blood guarantees nothing but a swift, silent demise. For centuries, the Bourbon family's glittering facade hid a dark secret. A lineage of brothers deemed inconvenient, their existence scrubbed, their stories silenced. Prepare to uncover the shocking truth behind the Forgotten Brothers and the lengths a dynasty would go to protect its crown. The story of the Bourbon dynasty is often told through the brilliance of its kings. The image of Louis XIV, the Sun King, dominates history like a blazing star that never fades. His grandeur at Versailles, his wars, and his absolute control over France have been told in countless ways. Yet behind the shimmering gold of his reign and the polished portraits of royal power, there were others, those born to the same bloodline but destined to live in the shadows. These were the brothers, half-brothers, and forgotten sons of the Bourbons. They carried the same name, the same crest, and yet found themselves watching the throne from a distance they could never cross. The French court was not only a place of glory, but a theater of constant tension. To be close to the king was both an honor and a danger. His siblings were bound to him by family and divided from him by ambition. The closer they were to power, the more fragile their lives became. Some lived in quiet exile, others in reluctant loyalty, and a few dared to dream of crowns that would never sit upon their heads. In the world of the Bourbons, birth was destiny. Every child born into the royal household came with expectations carved long before they drew breath. The firstborn son was the heir. The rest, no matter how gifted or brave, were reminders of what the crown could never divide. To rule was to exclude, and exclusion bred resentment. The story of Louis XIV's siblings and their descendants reveals not only the brilliance of France's monarchy, but also its hidden fractures. The silent tragedies behind the spectacle of absolute power. When Louis XIV was born in 1638, after more than 2 decades of childless marriage between King Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, he was hailed as a miracle. His birth was celebrated as a divine sign that France was blessed again. 2 years later came Philippe, the Duke of Anjou, later known as Philippe of Orléans. From the moment of his birth, Philippe's life was shaped not by his own choices, but by his brother's destiny. He was the second son, which meant he would never rule. His purpose was to serve and to support, and that role was carefully enforced by a mother who feared that rivalry could destroy the fragile unity of the crown. Anne of Austria, wise in court politics, made certain that Philippe would pose no threat. From childhood, he was surrounded by luxury and indulgence, but kept away from the serious affairs of state. The queen encouraged his interest in fashion, art, and dance, interests that kept him away from the political intrigues that might have made him dangerous. At court, whispers began to circulate that the younger brother of the king was too feminine, too frivolous, too weak to challenge authority. Yet beneath the powdered face and lavish dress was a mind sharper than anyone expected. As Louis XIV grew into the embodiment of absolute monarchy, Philippe found his own kind of influence. His private life at court was the subject of endless gossip, but on the battlefield he proved his worth. During the wars of the mid-17th century, Philippe commanded troops with courage and skill. His victory at the Battle of Cassel in 1677 was undeniable. Still, even triumph was a dangerous thing for a royal brother. The Sun King could not allow anyone, not even his own kin, to shine too brightly. Philippe's military career was quietly curtailed, and he was encouraged to retire from public command. It was an unspoken rule of Bourbon politics. Glory belonged to one man only. Behind the glittering surface, this was the quiet tragedy of the Bourbon siblings. To be royal was to live under watch. To be the king's brother was to live under suspicion. Power in France was centralized to the point where even loyalty could be misread as ambition. Philippe's life became a careful balancing act, enjoying the privileges of royalty while avoiding any gesture that might seem like a challenge. In that delicate dance, he learned to turn constraint into influence. His descendants would found the House of Orléans, a branch of the Bourbons that would later shape French politics long after the monarchy itself was gone. But Philippe was not the only one caught in the king's shadow. The Sun King's illegitimate children, though born outside the rules of inheritance, became players in their own right. Louis XIV had several children with his mistresses, including Louise de la Vallière and Madame de Montespan. These children were later legitimized, given titles, and married into powerful families. Their rise created waves of jealousy and unease among the old nobility. To many courtiers, the favor shown to these children blurred the sacred line between royal blood and common birth. Among them, Louis Auguste, Duke of Maine, stood out. He was Madame de Montespan's son and one of the king's favorites. His father's affection raised him high, but his mother's scandalous reputation tainted his name. As the king aged and began to worry about succession, he tried to secure positions for these children that would protect them from disgrace. Yet after the Sun King's death, the legitimized princes became pawns in the power struggles of the regency. The Duke of Maine was later stripped of much of his authority, proving that favor from the throne could vanish as quickly as it appeared. The Bourbon story of shadows stretches beyond Louis XIV's lifetime. His own descendants inherited not only his power, but also his family's complex network of rivalries. When Louis XV rose to the throne as a child, the question of who would guide him became a matter of survival for those still tied to the royal bloodline. The Orleans branch, descended from Philippe, found itself once again at the center of politics. Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, served as regent for the young king. In his hands, the kingdom's future hung uncertainly between renewal and decay. The regent was intelligent, ambitious, and pragmatic, yet his reputation was clouded by accusations of corruption and moral excess. He ruled France in an age of exhaustion after decades of Louis XIV's wars. While he restored some stability, his tenure deepened the sense that the monarchy was losing its sacred aura. To be a Bourbon in this period was to inherit not just glory, but public suspicion. The dynasty had become a family both revered and resented, admired for its grandeur but blamed for its distance from ordinary people. As the 18th century unfolded, the Bourbons faced new pressures from within and beyond. Each generation seemed to produce another forgotten prince or sidelined duke, men of royal blood whose lives were defined by their inability to claim more. Some turned to philosophy, some to the army, and others to quiet exile. Their existence reveals how fragile monarchy could be when bound so tightly to hierarchy. The same system that gave the Bourbons their power also ensured that most of them would live unfulfilled, serving a crown they could never wear. The pattern repeated itself across Europe. The Spanish branch of the Bourbons, descended from Louis XIV's grandson Philip, mirrored the same tensions. Philip V of Spain was a product of Versailles, raised in the image of the French court. When he took the Spanish throne, his reign brought both promise and instability. Behind him stood a line of brothers and cousins watching the shifting balance of inheritance and war. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought partly over his claim, reshaped the map of Europe. It also revealed how the family's internal rivalries could ignite continental conflict. The throne was never just a seat of power, it was a magnet for danger. Every Bourbon brother faced the same paradox. Loyalty was demanded, but independence was punished. To defy the king was treason, but to be too loyal was to risk irrelevance. The tension between these extremes defined their lives. In letters, diaries, and court records, one can glimpse moments of longing and quiet rebellion. The king's siblings often struggled with their role as symbols of unity in a system built on exclusion. They were meant to embody royal virtue, yet they lived surrounded by envy, isolation, and constant comparison. Philippe of Orléans' later years capture this struggle perfectly. As he aged, he withdrew to his estate at St. Cloud, surrounded by art, gardens, and the comfort of family. Though he was never allowed to command armies again, his children and grandchildren carried on his legacy. Through them, his bloodline endured the fall of Versailles, the Revolution, and the long shadow of history. When France finally overthrew its monarchy, it was a descendant of Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, known as Philippe Égalité, who voted for the execution of King Louis XVI. The irony was chilling. The brothers' lineage, once suppressed to preserve the crown, would later help to end it. This cycle of light and shadow makes the story of the Bourbon siblings more than a tale of court life. It is a study in how power shapes families, how love and duty collide when one person holds everything, and how history forgets those who stood too close to greatness. For every king remembered, there were brothers erased from memory, men who carried royal blood but whose names faded behind the gold curtains of Versailles. In their silence, we see the cost of absolute monarchy. Louis XIV's rule created a state where every life revolved around the throne. The palace at Versailles was designed to display that truth in every corridor and mirror. The king's courtiers lived in constant performance, their survival dependent on his attention. For his siblings, the performance never ended. They had to be loyal yet harmless, visible yet invisible. It was a world where even affection was political, and every gesture could be read as rebellion. To live in the shadow of the Sun King was to live in constant awareness of one's limits. The king's light illuminated France, but it also burned those too near. The brothers who survived did so by learning to bend rather than resist. Yet in their quiet endurance, they shaped the monarchy's legacy in ways the king himself might never have intended. The Orleans line would later influence revolutions and republican ideals, carrying the contradictions of Bourbon blood into a new age. The forgotten brothers of the Bourbons remind us that history's brightness often hides its darker edges. Power never exists without shadow, and in those shadows lie the human stories that make empires rise and fall. The triumph of Louis XIV was built not only on war and splendor, but also on the silent obedience of those who shared his name. Their absence in the grand portraits of the era speaks volumes about how monarchy sustains itself, by narrowing the circle of power until only one stands at the center. In the quiet halls of St. Cloud, in the fading tapestries of the Orleans palaces, and in the scattered archives of forgotten dukes, we find echoes of these lives. They were not rebels nor villains, but witnesses to a system that demanded total submission in exchange for survival. Their stories invite us to look beyond the crown and see the fragile humanity within royal blood. The shadow of the Sun King stretches far beyond his lifetime. It reaches into every story of a brother who served, a cousin who vanished from record, a child legitimized and later disowned. It tells us that behind every throne lies a family, and within every family, a struggle between love and power. The Bourbons, for all their majesty, were not spared that truth. The brilliance of the Sun King may have dazzled the world, but in the end, even light fades. What endures are the stories of those who stood beside him, those whose lives remind us that greatness often depends on silence, and that the most revealing history is not always written by the ones who ruled, but by those who were forced to watch. The brilliance of the Sun King faded slowly, like the setting of an endless day. Yet even as the golden light dimmed, the dangers that had surrounded him did not vanish. They shifted, taking on new shapes, new whispers, and new victims. Power in the Bourbon world had never been a safe inheritance. It was not passed from one hand to another without wounds. Those who stood closest to the throne often found themselves standing on the edge of ruin, trapped between loyalty and survival. For the family of Louis XIV, the path to power was lined with suspicion, betrayal, and the silent threat of death that lingered in every corridor of Versailles. Among those who walked this perilous path was Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the younger brother of the Sun King. His story had begun in the shadows and would end there as well. Marked by ambition he was not allowed to show and punishment he could never escape. Philippe's life was shaped by the contradictions of his brother's reign. He was at once pampered and restrained, honored and humiliated, adored and feared. His victories on the battlefield brought him pride, yet they also deepened the king's unease. Every triumph became a reminder of how fragile the hierarchy truly was. The closer Philippe came to distinction, the more dangerous he became. In the years that followed the Battle of Cassel, the relationship between the two brothers grew more strained. Philippe's success in war had proven that he possessed both courage and command, qualities that could inspire loyalty among soldiers and respect among nobles. For Louis XIV, this was intolerable. The Sun King's authority depended on the idea that only he could embody the greatness of France. There could be no rival star in his firmament. He masked his fear behind a display of affection, granting Philippe lavish gifts, titles, and estates. Yet each gesture of generosity carried the unspoken warning that all of it could be taken away in a moment. Versailles was not only a palace, it was a gilded prison. As years passed, Philippe learned to navigate this web of power with careful grace. His marriage to Henrietta of England, the daughter of the executed Charles I, was a union meant to strengthen political ties between France and England. But the match brought more sorrow than stability. Henrietta was young, intelligent, and full of life, admired at court for her wit and charm. She quickly won the affection of the king himself, a closeness that fed endless rumors. Some whispered that Louis's fondness for his sister-in-law went beyond propriety. Others believed that their friendship was innocent, but that the court's jealousy would twist it into scandal. Philippe, caught between pride and insecurity, became consumed by doubt. The fragile balance between the brothers began to crack. For Philippe, every smile shared between his wife and his brother seemed to mock him. His temper flared in private, and the Queen Mother's efforts to keep peace between them failed. The tension reached its breaking point in the summer of 1670, when Henrietta suddenly fell ill and died within hours after drinking a glass of chicory water at her residence in St. Cloud. Her death stunned the court. She had been in perfect health only the day before, and her collapse was too swift, too violent, to seem natural. The whispers began at once. She had been poisoned. The accusation spread through France and beyond. Some claimed that Philippe himself, driven by jealousy, had ordered her death. Others believed that agents of the king had silenced her to conceal an affair or to prevent political intrigue with England. The English court demanded an investigation, and doctors performed an autopsy under strict supervision. Their conclusion declared that Henrietta had died of natural causes, a ruptured ulcer, yet few believed it. Even in death, she remained a symbol of the hidden dangers of royal life. In the world of the Bourbons, truth was never simple, and appearances were everything. Whether or not Henrietta was murdered mattered less than the fact that so many believed she could be. The tragedy marked Philippe for the rest of his life. He remarried, this time to Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, known as Madame Palatine, a woman of blunt honesty and fierce temper. Their marriage, while not affectionate, was at least stable. She would become one of the most vivid chroniclers of court life through her many letters, describing with unsparing detail the deceit, vanity, and fear that defined the royal household. Through her words, we glimpse Philippe not as a villain, but as a man shaped by forces far greater than himself, a prince who longed for respect in a world that mocked his every effort to claim it. As the years passed, Philippe withdrew more and more from the king's orbit. He turned his attention to his estates, to his children, and to the pleasures of private life. Yet even in retreat, he remained bound to the crown. His son, also named Philippe, inherited the title of Duke of Orléans and would one day serve as regent for the young Louis XV. The cycle repeated itself. The king's brother or cousin granted power only in the absence of the king, and only for as long as the throne allowed it. Every generation of Bourbons seemed destined to play the same roles: the ruler, the shadow, and the scapegoat. The rumors that surrounded the death of Henrietta never fully disappeared. They became part of a larger pattern, a recurring theme in the dark theater of royal politics. Poison was the weapon of choice in a court where open violence was impossible. To accuse someone of poisoning was to question their loyalty, their virtue, and their very right to exist within the circle of power. The fear of it haunted Versailles. Every meal, every drink, every medicine was suspect. The Sun King himself employed food tasters, and dishes were sealed before reaching his table. Trust was an illusion, and suspicion was the air they breathed. For Philippe, the whispers of poison were both literal and symbolic. They represented the invisible danger of living too close to the throne. One could be destroyed not by enemies, but by proximity itself. In the eyes of the court, every misfortune, every sudden death, every fall from favor was attributed to some hidden plot. It was easier to believe in murder than to accept the randomness of fate. And so, the legend of the poisoned duchess endured, a story that revealed more about the paranoia of power than about the truth of her death. After Philippe's own passing in 1701, his descendants continued to walk the same treacherous path. His son, Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, inherited both the title and the burden of his father's legacy. When Louis XIV died in 1715, leaving the throne to a child of only 5 years, the younger Philippe became regent of France. It was the highest position a Bourbon could hold without being king, and it came with equal parts glory and danger. The regent's authority depended on the fragile balance between the crown and the nobility, between ambition and restraint. The court that had once worshipped the Sun King now turned its eyes toward his nephew, testing his resolve, questioning his motives, and waiting for his fall. The new Duke of Orléans was a man of intellect and curiosity, fluent in languages, skilled in mathematics, and deeply interested in science. Yet he was also reckless, indulgent, and haunted by the same mistrust that had poisoned his father's world. His regency was marked by both progress and scandal. He tried to reform the economy, to strengthen the navy, and to promote education, but his private life became the subject of endless gossip. Versailles, freed from the rigid etiquette of Louis XIV's rule, sank into moral chaos. The regent's late-night gatherings, filled with wine, music, and laughter, gave his enemies the perfect weapon against him. To many, he was not a guardian of the crown but a corrupter of it. As his influence grew, so did the fear that he might seek the throne for himself. The pattern repeated, the suspicion that no Bourbon brother could be content in the shadow of another. Rumors of poison returned once again. When several members of the royal family fell ill in quick succession, whispers spread that the regent had arranged their deaths to clear the line of succession. The charges were never proven, and no evidence was found, but in a court built on intrigue, proof was less important than belief. The same people who had once accused his father of murder now cast the same shadow over him. The paranoia of the age was not entirely unfounded. Poison had become a real and terrifying tool of politics during the latter years of the Sun King's reign. The infamous affair of the poisons in the 1670s had exposed a vast network of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and assassins who sold lethal powders and potions to desperate nobles. Even members of the royal household were implicated, including Madame de Montespan, the king's former mistress. The scandal revealed how deeply fear and ambition had corroded the foundations of monarchy. By the time Philippe II ruled as regent, the memory of those crimes still lingered. Every unexplained death revived old nightmares. The regent tried to dismiss the rumors, but they clung to him until his death in 1723. He was found lifeless in his private apartments after a supper with friends. The official cause was apoplexy, yet once again, the whispers began. Some said he had been poisoned by political rivals, others that his own excesses had killed him. History offers no clear answer, only the same haunting pattern. In the Bourbon world, no death was innocent, and no life near the throne was safe. This atmosphere of mistrust was not limited to the Orleans branch. Across generations, the Bourbons' proximity to power turned their lives into a dangerous game. The princes of the blood, as they were called, were trapped between two impossible roles. Too royal to be ordinary, too secondary to rule. Their existence was both privilege and curse. They were used as political pawns, their marriages arranged for strategy, their loyalties questioned, their every move observed. For them, the path to power was not a road to glory, but a labyrinth of dangers from which few escaped unscathed. Even in the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas began to challenge the divine right of kings, the old fears remained. The royal family, still haunted by the ghosts of past scandals, lived under constant surveillance. When Louis XV came of age, he sought to restore dignity to the crown, but the damage was already done. The nobility had grown cynical, and the people had lost their faith. The Bourbons' internal rivalries had weakened the very institution they sought to protect. The Sun King's legacy of absolute authority had created a system so rigid that it could no longer adapt without breaking. Philippe's descendants would one day see that collapse firsthand. The Orleans line, born from the brother once sidelined by the Sun King, would outlive the main branch of the family. When revolution swept through France, it was a Duke of Orleans who cast the deciding vote for the execution of Louis XVI, his own cousin. That act, seen by some as betrayal and by others as justice, marked the end of the monarchy that had consumed his ancestors. The perilous path that began in the court of Louis XIV had finally reached its end, not in triumph, but in tragedy. Yet even then, the shadow of the past remained. The story of Philippe and his descendants is not only a chronicle of ambition and intrigue, it is a reflection of the human cost of power. To be born near the throne was to inherit danger disguised as privilege. Every smile hid calculation, every friendship carried risk, and every gesture could be turned into accusation. The Bourbons built their world upon control, but control bred fear, and fear, in time, destroyed them. In the long view of history, Philippe's life stands as both warning and lament. He lived surrounded by beauty and wealth, yet was denied freedom and trust. His wife's mysterious death, the court's poisonous whispers, and his own uncertain legacy reveal how little joy power could bring when stripped of security. His descendants repeated his struggles in different forms, proving that the dangers of monarchy were not confined to any single reign. The crown that shone so brightly over France cast shadows deep enough to swallow generations. To walk near the throne was to live on borrowed time. Philippe, Duke of Orleans, learned that truth early and carried it to his grave. The world saw his silks, his jewels, and his banquets, but behind the splendor lay the constant fear that the same cup that toasted his fortune might also end his life. The Bourbons ruled with divine right, but they lived as prisoners of suspicion. Their story reminds us that power, when concentrated in one family, becomes both crown and curse, glory and doom. In the glittering age of the Sun King, it was not the enemies outside the palace who posed the greatest threat. It was the quiet, unseen peril waiting within its golden walls. And so the shadow lengthened, not just over Versailles, but over the very idea of monarchy. Each generation of Bourbons inherited not only the throne, but the fear that came with it. The line between power and peril blurred until it vanished entirely. Philippe's life and the whispers that followed him were more than scandal, they were prophecy. They foretold the downfall of a dynasty that could not escape its own darkness. The perilous path to power was never about ambition alone. It was about survival in a world where trust could kill and loyalty could damn. The Bourbons, for all their glory, lived in a kingdom of mirrors, where every reflection might conceal a threat. Philippe's fate, and that of his family, reveals the truth behind the legend. In the court of kings, even sunlight can burn. The fall of the Bourbon monarchy did not silence its ghosts. It only gave them new voices, whispering through the ruins of palaces and the narrow streets of a nation torn between the past and the promise of liberty. The shadows that once haunted Versailles now stretched across revolutionary France, and the dangers that had followed princes and kings through the glittering halls of power found new life in the dungeons of the people's justice. The perilous path that Philippe, Duke of Orléans, had once walked as the brother of the Sun King was now trodden by his descendants, but in a world transformed by blood and fear. The throne had fallen, the crown shattered, yet the same ancient curse remained. To be born near power was to inherit peril. Nowhere was this truth more tragically embodied than in the brief and tormented life of Louis Charles, Duke of Normandy, the boy the world would remember as the lost king, Louis XVII. He was born in the spring of 1785, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. His elder brother, Louis Joseph, had been the Dauphin of France, the heir to the throne, but illness carried him away before his 8th birthday. With his death, the title passed to the younger boy, who was then not yet 5. In the grand order of monarchy, the line of succession seemed secure once more. Few could have imagined that within a decade, both the father and the child would be prisoners, and the crown itself would become a symbol of treason. Louis Charles entered the world in the waning days of royal splendor. Versailles still glittered, the courtiers still bowed, and the fountains still sang in the gardens, but beneath the surface, the old order was collapsing. Famine, debt, and anger simmered among the people. The court's extravagance had become an emblem of indifference. While the boy played in the marble halls of the Trianon, Paris was starving. His parents, though not without compassion, were trapped in the rituals of monarchy, blind to how swiftly the tide was turning. The revolution would come not as a surprise, but as a storm that everyone had seen forming and no one had believed could break. When the revolution erupted in 1789, Louis Charles was only 4 years old. He was still a child of laughter and games, adored by his mother and sisters. His father, though often distant, took pride in his gentleness and intelligence. The boy's bright eyes and curious nature reminded courtiers of the promise of renewal, of a future where the monarchy might find grace again. But history had other plans. The storming of the Bastille, the march of the women to Versailles, and the forced relocation of the royal family to the Tuileries Palace turned that childhood into captivity. The walls that once protected him now confined him. The little Dauphin's world shrank to the narrow chambers of a guarded palace, where whispers of treason echoed even in the silence. To the revolutionaries, he was not an innocent child, but a symbol of everything they sought to destroy. His name carried the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy, and his very existence was an offense to the new order. To his parents, he remained their beloved son, but even their love could not shield him. As the revolution deepened, the family's isolation grew. Guards watched their every move, and loyalty became a crime punishable by death. In the summer of 1792, the monarchy fell. The king was deposed, and France was declared a republic. Louis XVI was now citizen caput, stripped of his title and dignity. Marie Antoinette became widow caput in the eyes of the state. For Louis Charles, barely 7 years old, the change meant the loss of his childhood. The Tuileries was attacked, the royal guards slaughtered, and the family imprisoned in the medieval fortress of the Temple. The once proud Dauphin of France now slept behind iron bars. The months that followed were marked by fear and degradation. The boy's father faced trial for treason before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The proceedings were a performance, his guilt predetermined, his death inevitable. In January of 1793, Louis XVI was led to the guillotine. It was a cold morning when the blade fell, and the crowd's roar rose like thunder across Paris. Inside the temple, Marie Antoinette fell to her knees in prayer. The guards told her that her husband was dead, and that her son was now, by right of blood, King Louis XVII. But in the Republic, that title meant nothing. To proclaim himself king would be to sign his own death warrant. Even as a child, he was a rival to the revolution. The new regime understood the power of symbols. They knew that as long as the boy lived, monarchists would rally around his name. His small body carried the weight of a dynasty. To them, it was not enough to kill a king. They had to erase the very idea of monarchy from the living world. And so began one of the most haunting chapters in French history, the imprisonment and disappearance of Louis Charles. After his father's execution, the boy was separated from his mother and sister. He was placed under the care of a shoemaker named Antoine Simon, appointed by the Committee of Public Safety to act as his guardian and to turn the little prince into an ordinary citizen. The man was loyal to the revolution, but not entirely cruel. He taught the boy songs of liberty and tried to replace the rituals of royalty with the manners of the people. Yet even kindness in such a place was twisted. The child was isolated, indoctrinated, and at times beaten. He was told to curse his parents, to renounce his name, and to declare himself the son of no one. His world became a dark cell, his companions rats and silence. In October of 1793, Marie Antoinette herself was brought to trial. The charges against her were grotesque, the verdict inevitable. The boy's forced testimony was used to accuse his mother of unspeakable crimes. Too young to understand the weight of his words, he repeated what had been demanded of him, sealing her fate. A few days later, she was executed. From that moment, the boy was truly alone. Months turned to years, and the child in the temple faded from memory. Guards changed, orders shifted, and still he remained locked away. The revolution devoured its own leaders. Danton, Robespierre, and others fell beneath the blade, but the little prisoner endured in silence. When the reign of terror ended, few in Paris remembered that the son of Louis XVI was still alive, buried within the walls of his prison. When he was finally found, it was already too late. On a June day in 1795, the boy who might have been king was declared dead at the age of 10. The official cause was illness, but the truth was more complicated, more cruel. The body that was carried out of the temple was small, pale, and frail, scarred by neglect. An autopsy was performed by Republican doctors who claimed he had died of tuberculosis. Yet the marks on his skin told another story: sores, bruises, signs of confinement. His heart, removed during the examination, was secretly preserved by one of the physicians, Philippe Jean Pelletan, who, perhaps moved by pity, could not bring himself to let the relic of a king's son vanish into the earth. He placed it in a glass jar, where it would become one of the strangest symbols of French history: a heart without a body, a king without a crown. But death in the age of revolution was never simple. As soon as news of his demise spread, rumors began to grow. Many refused to believe that the child who died in the temple was truly Louis Charles. The secrecy of his imprisonment, the uncertainty of his final days, and the chaos that followed the fall of the terror gave birth to legends. Some said he had been smuggled out by royalists disguised as guards, replaced by a dying orphan. Others claimed that sympathetic revolutionaries had saved him, sending him abroad under a false name. The idea that the true heir of France still lived became a myth that would endure for generations. Throughout the 19th century, impostors appeared across Europe, each claiming to be the lost king. The most famous was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a watchmaker from Prussia who arrived in France in the 1830s, insisting he was Louis XVII. He spoke of secret passages, of guards who had helped him escape, of hidden rooms within the temple. His knowledge of the royal family's private details astonished many, and some of those who had once served at court swore they recognized him. Others saw only a clever fraud. He lived out his life in exile, still proclaiming his royal identity, and even inscribed upon his tomb the words, Louis Charles of France. His story, like so many others, blurred the line between hope and deception. The mystery of Louis Charles's fate became more than a question of one child's death. It was a mirror held up to the conscience of France. His imprisonment and supposed murder were not merely acts of revenge against a family. They were symbols of a nation struggling to define justice after centuries of oppression. To the revolutionaries, he was the last remnant of tyranny, an inheritance of divine right that had to be destroyed. To the royalists, he was innocence crucified, a martyr for the old order. The truth lay buried somewhere between myth and fact, between the heart in a jar and the countless claims of men who swore they were him. For historians, the mystery lingered for more than 2 centuries. It was not until the dawn of the 21st century that science offered an answer. DNA tests compared the preserved heart of the supposed Louis XVII with strands of hair from Marie Antoinette's relatives. The result confirmed the match. The heart in the jar was indeed that of the lost prince. After 200 years of speculation, the child who had vanished in the temple was finally given a name again. His remains were interred in the royal crypt at St. Denis, alongside his parents. Yet even with proof, the unease remains. Knowing how he died does not make his death less haunting. Louis Charles's story stands as one of the most chilling reflections of how absolute power and absolute hatred can mirror each other. He was born to rule, but condemned before he could understand the meaning of the crown. To his captors, he was not a boy but a threat, proof that the monarchy could be reborn as long as one royal heart still beat. They feared him not for what he had done, but for what he represented. The child became a battlefield upon which ideology fought humanity, and humanity lost. His life also reveals the cruel logic that has followed every heir in the shadow of the Bourbons. From Philippe's suspected involvement in his wife's death to the paranoia that surrounded every Bourbon descendant, the theme remained unchanged. Power made family bonds into chains, and the closer one was to the throne, the closer one came to destruction. For Louis Charles, that destruction arrived not through intrigue or ambition, but through the simple fact of being born into the wrong moment of history. Even as a child, he embodied both the hope and the curse of his lineage. In the revolution's fervor to erase the old order, they treated him as if killing the idea required killing the boy. Yet history would not allow such erasure. His silence, his confinement, and his unmarked grave became louder than any throne could be. He became the eternal reminder of how fear, once unleashed, can destroy even what it claims to liberate. The tragedy of Louis Charles, Duke of Normandy, is not only that he died so young, but that his death was necessary to both sides. To the Republic, it was a cruel necessity. To the Royalists, it was a martyrdom. To history, it remains a wound that refuses to close. His brief life bridges two worlds, the glittering order of the Bourbons and the turbulent dawn of modern France. In him, the old monarchy ended not with a coronation but with a whisper, a child's cry swallowed by stone walls. In the centuries since, the story of the lost king has become a parable of innocence caught between the machinery of power. It reminds us that every revolution, no matter how righteous its cause, carries the danger of becoming what it destroys. Louis Charles was not guilty of the sins of kings, yet he paid for them with his life. In that sense, he was not only the last child of the monarchy, but also its final sacrifice. The heart that beat once within his small chest rests now in marble silence, but its story still echoes. It speaks of the fear that haunted his ancestors, of Philippe's paranoia and the poisoned whispers of Versailles, of the same curse that had followed the Bourbons from their palaces to their prisons. Power, once gained, had always demanded a price. For the Bourbons, that price was blood. For Louis Charles, it was childhood itself. The shadow of the throne, once cast by the Sun King, had grown long enough to reach the walls of the temple. And in that shadow, the boy who might have been king became something greater and more terrible, a symbol of what power can do when it forgets mercy. His story closes the circle begun by his ancestors, from the intrigues of Philippe of Orléans to the revolutions that consumed their legacy. The perilous path to power had ended at last, not in triumph or restoration, but in a locked cell where a child's voice faded into silence, leaving behind only the echo of his name. The shadow of the Bourbons did not fade with the death of Louis Charles. The revolution had shattered their crown, scattered their family, and drenched their history in blood, but the dynasty itself endured. It lived on in the branches that spread beyond France, in Spain, Naples, and Parma, where the same blood still pulsed beneath different crowns. Yet wherever that bloodline flowed, it carried the same burden, the inescapable weight of ancestry, the peril that came not from enemies outside, but from the very alliances that promised survival. The tragedy of the Bourbons was not merely that they lost their thrones. It was that they could never stop being royal, even when royalty had become a curse. In the wake of the French Revolution, Europe trembled. Monarchs watched in horror as a king and queen were executed by their own people, and a child was left to die in a prison cell. The fall of the Bourbons was more than a political event. It was a warning. Across the continent, royal families tightened their grip on power, strengthened their armies, and forged new alliances to prevent the same fate. Yet the same marriages and treaties meant to preserve stability often sowed new seeds of ruin. Few lives demonstrate this more clearly than that of Ferdinand, Duke of Parma, whose story reveals how even survival could become a form of punishment when one's bloodline was both weapon and wound. Ferdinand of Parma was born in the middle of the 18th century into a world defined by diplomacy. He was the grandson of Philip V of Spain, the first Bourbon king to rule outside France, and thus a direct descendant of the Sun King himself. Through this Spanish line, the Bourbons had extended their influence into Italy, placing Ferdinand's father, Philip, as Duke of Parma. His mother, Princess Louise Elizabeth, was a daughter of Louis XV of France, which made Ferdinand a bridge between two powerful courts, French and Spanish. From the moment of his birth, his destiny was not his own. His marriage, his faith, his alliances, even his thoughts would belong to the needs of his family and the balance of power in Europe. The court of Parma was small compared to the grandeur of Versailles or Madrid, but it was rich in culture and ambition. The duchy sat like a pawn between empires, its rulers expected to serve as obedient instruments of Bourbon policy. Ferdinand's education reflected this role. He was taught diplomacy before childhood had ended, instructed to speak carefully, to flatter with grace, and to obey the expectations of both France and Spain. Yet behind his tutor's lessons and his family's political plans, Ferdinand harbored a deep sense of faith and a longing for independence. He was not a warrior like his ancestors, nor a schemer. He was a man who sought peace in a world that offered none. When Ferdinand came of age, his marriage was arranged to further the intricate web of dynastic power. He was wed to Archduchess Maria Amalia of Austria, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa and sister of Marie Antoinette. The match was intended to unite Bourbon and Habsburg bloodlines, bridging centuries of rivalry between France, Spain, and Austria. To the courts that arranged it, this was a triumph of diplomacy. To the young couple themselves, it was the beginning of tragedy. Ferdinand was devout, reserved, and obedient, while Maria Amalia was spirited, intelligent, and determined to assert herself in a male-dominated court. Their union was less a marriage than a political treaty, and like most treaties of its kind, it carried the seeds of conflict. At first, Parma welcomed its new duchess with celebration. The union of Bourbon and Habsburg blood was seen as a guarantee of stability. But Maria Amalia soon discovered that her new home was little more than a puppet state, its policies dictated by foreign courts. She bristled at the control exercised by Spain and France, especially by her father-in-law, who ruled through a network of ministers loyal to Madrid. The young duchess's attempts to assert authority were met with resistance. When she began to influence Ferdinand against the dominance of Spanish advisors, letters of protest flew across Europe. The marriage that was meant to strengthen alliances instead became a spark of tension among them. Ferdinand found himself torn between duty and affection. He admired his wife's courage, but feared her defiance. His upbringing had taught him obedience to family and faith, and rebellion, even for love, seemed impossible. The conflict between them mirrored the greater struggle of their age, the desire for autonomy against the machinery of dynastic politics. In public, Ferdinand was a courteous ruler, promoting the arts and charity, but in private, he wrestled with despair. He knew that every decision he made was watched, measured, and judged by those who claimed to love him but used him as a pawn. The Bourbon family's reach across Europe had always been both its strength and its weakness. In France, the revolution had exposed the dangers of isolation from the people. In Italy, the same arrogance took a subtler form. Parma's rulers lived in elegant restraint, dependent on Spanish subsidies and French protection, their sovereignty little more than ceremony. Ferdinand's title as duke gave him prestige but no true power. Each letter from Madrid or Versailles reminded him that he ruled only by permission. Even his children were viewed as pieces on the board of European politics, their futures negotiated before they could speak. The winds of change that had destroyed the French monarchy did not stop at the Alps. Revolutionary ideas crossed borders disguised as whispers, pamphlets, and songs. The people of Parma, like others in Italy, began to dream of freedom and reform. Ferdinand, though not an enemy of progress, stood helpless as events overtook him. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power in France, he sought to reshape Europe according to his own vision. To him, the small duchies and kingdoms that dotted Italy were relics of a dying age, obstacles to the unity and control he desired. The Bourbon Duke of Parma, with his ties to France and Spain, was both useful and expendable. In the closing years of the 18th century, Napoleon's armies swept through Italy, crushing resistance and installing new governments loyal to him. Parma, caught between empires, could not defend itself. Ferdinand attempted neutrality, but neutrality had no place in Napoleon's world. In the Treaty of Aranjuez, Spain, under pressure from France, agreed to surrender Parma to French control in exchange for the creation of a new kingdom for Ferdinand's son-in-law. The Duke's fate was sealed not by war, but by negotiation. His family's alliances, once their greatest defense, had become the instruments of their destruction. When French troops entered Parma, they came not as conquerors, but as administrators of destiny. Ferdinand was treated with a show of respect, but it was the respect of a jailer for his prisoner. He was forced to sign decrees that ceded his authority, his guards replaced by French officers, his court dissolved. His wife, Maria Amalia, raged against the humiliation, but there was nothing to be done. The duchy that had been theirs by inheritance was now a possession of the French Republic. The bloodline that had once ruled half of Europe now bowed to a man who had risen from obscurity through genius and ambition. Ferdinand's final years were marked by quiet despair. He was confined to his palace under what was politely called supervision, but was, in truth, house arrest. Letters from his relatives in Spain and Austria offered sympathy, but no help. The same network of kinship that had bound him to power now bound him to obedience. The French allowed him to retain his title, but stripped him of authority. When he died in the early years of the 19th century, it was as a ruler without a realm, a Bourbon reduced to memory. His duchy was absorbed into the Napoleonic system, his heirs scattered, and his name soon overshadowed by greater tragedies. Maria Amalia survived him by several years, living long enough to witness the fall of Napoleon and the restoration of Bourbon power in Europe. Yet even then, the old order could not return unbroken. The world had changed too deeply. The Restoration brought back kings and princes, but it could not erase the knowledge that their power rested on fragile foundations. The people who had once worshipped the crown now watched it with suspicion. The Bourbons who returned to their thrones did so under the gaze of nations that had learned to question the divine right they claimed. The burden of bloodline, once their pride, had become their prison. Ferdinand's story is quieter than that of his French cousins, yet it speaks to the same truth that runs through the entire Bourbon saga. Power, when inherited, carries not only privilege but danger. The alliances that seem to guarantee stability often ensure dependency. The marriages arranged for diplomacy become traps for the heart and the spirit. Ferdinand's life was one long negotiation between faith and duty, love and obedience. His downfall was not the result of rebellion or vice, but of being caught between forces too vast for one man to resist. The tragedy of the Duke of Parma also reveals the limits of royal blood. The Bourbons believed that their lineage carried divine sanction, that their right to rule was eternal. Yet that very belief blinded them to how the world had changed. The same family connections that once gave them strength now linked them to a system despised by the new generation. Ferdinand's attempts to rule justly were undermined by the perception that he was merely a puppet of foreign powers. His people's loyalty was divided between resentment and pity. In the end, he represented not tyranny, but the exhaustion of monarchy itself, a man trapped by history, too noble to betray his heritage, too human to escape it. As the 19th century unfolded, the Bourbons of Parma, like their cousins in Spain and Naples, continued to struggle for relevance. They were restored, exiled, and restored again, their fate swinging with the tides of European politics. Yet the pattern remained unchanged. Each generation was born with the same burden: to bear a name that could never be ordinary, to live under the shadow of greatness that had long since turned to ruin. The alliances they forged to preserve themselves only deepened their entanglement in the ambitions of others. In time, even their wealth and titles could not protect them from the truth that power without freedom is merely another form of captivity. The story of Ferdinand, Duke of Parma, closes the long arc that began with the brilliance of the Sun King. From Versailles to the Temple prison, from the gilded halls of France to the quiet palaces of Italy, the Bourbons carried the same inheritance, a legacy too heavy for any one life to bear. Theirs was a dynasty that rose on the promise of divine right and fell beneath the weight of its own perfection. Ferdinand's downfall was not written in the stars, but in the treaties signed by men who believed they could control destiny through marriage and blood. His exile was a quieter echo of the guillotine, a slow erasure rather than a sudden blow. In the end, the Bourbons were not undone by enemies, but by the logic of their own system. They treated their children as instruments of strategy, their marriages as transactions, their people as possessions. Ferdinand's life, gentle and devout though it was, could not escape that inheritance. His tragedy was not dramatic like that of Louis XVI or his doomed son, but it was no less complete. He lived and died under the illusion of sovereignty, his crown a memory, his authority a mask. Through him, the story of the Bourbons comes full circle. A family that once ruled by divine will reduce to pawns in a game they had invented. The bloodline that had illuminated Europe for centuries had become its own burden, binding each generation to the mistakes of the last. Ferdinand's quiet exile, his unmarked end, and the fading of his name into the background of history remind us that power, no matter how ancient or noble, is never secure. The same alliances that build empires also seal their fates. The Bourbons' legacy endures not in their palaces or portraits, but in the lessons they leave behind. That greatness without humility breeds downfall, and that those born to rule often suffer most under the weight of their own crowns. Ferdinand, Duke of Parma, carried that weight to the end, a man born to continue a dynasty already doomed by its own perfection. His life was the final sigh of a world that believed blood could dictate destiny, and his death marked the quiet closing of a chapter that had begun in the blinding light of the Sun King. The story of Ferdinand, Duke of Parma, and those who shared his blood leaves behind a silence more haunting than any monument. The Bourbon name, once whispered with awe across courts and capitals, became a reminder of how fragile greatness can be. As Europe turned the page into a new century, the world that had built Versailles and crowned kings by divine right faded into memory. The palaces still stood, their mirrors still reflecting light, but the faces that had once filled them with life had vanished, leaving only portraits, fixed smiles, frozen gestures, and the illusion of permanence. Behind those images lay the truth. That power, when bound to lineage rather than purpose, is a labyrinth with no exit. The Bourbons had ruled for generations, but what they truly left behind was a legacy of paradox. They had united kingdoms, inspired revolutions, and redrawn the map of Europe more than once. Yet within their own family, they sowed division, envy, and loss. Their tragedies were not born of weakness alone, but of the very strength that had sustained them. To be a Bourbon was to inherit the idea of perfection, to embody the authority of God on earth, and to believe that the world itself revolved around the crown. But in the end, the world moved on without them, proving that the brilliance of power can blind even those who wield it. Ferdinand's quiet death in exile was not just an ending. It was the echo of centuries of ambition collapsing under its own weight. The same patterns that had shaped the lives of Philippe, Duke of Orléans, and Louis Charles, Duke of Normandy, returned once more in different guises: suspicion, betrayal, and isolation. Each had lived in a world where proximity to the throne meant peril, where the bonds of family could strangle more than they supported. The Bourbons, in all their magnificence, had built an empire of control but could never escape the consequences of it. Their history reads like a mirror held up to humanity's oldest dilemma. How much can power demand before it destroys the soul that carries it? The labyrinth of their legacy stretches far beyond the courts of France or the duchies of Italy. It winds through the conscience of Europe itself. When the Bourbons rose, monarchy was a divine institution, unquestioned and sacred. When they fell, the world learned that no crown is immune to doubt. The French Revolution did more than dethrone a king. It changed how humanity understood authority. The blood spilled on the guillotine's blade washed away centuries of illusion. Even for those Bourbons who survived, the age of unquestioned rule was over. Their descendants would govern again, but they would never rule in the same way. The labyrinth had shifted, and the exits were closing. To understand their legacy, one must see beyond the grandeur and the tragedy and into the pattern that connects them all. Power, by its nature, isolates. Every Bourbon monarch stood at the center of an intricate web: advisors, ministers, generals, and family, all orbiting around the idea of the king. Yet the closer one stood to that center, the greater the danger. Philippe of Orléans discovered it when victory on the battlefield drew suspicion rather than praise. Louis Charles suffered it as a child when his bloodline condemned him to die in a cell for crimes he never committed. Ferdinand felt it when his title became a cage built from treaties and obligations. Their stories, though distant in time and place, speak with one voice about the loneliness of power. In the labyrinth of monarchy, affection becomes strategy and loyalty turns to calculation. Every smile conceals intent, every gesture hides a message. The Bourbon court, with its polished etiquette and glittering ceremonies, was a theater where survival depended on performance. The brothers, cousins, and children who stood behind the throne learned early that sincerity could be fatal. To speak one's mind was to risk being misunderstood. To seek independence was to invite ruin. Even love itself became a weapon. Marriages arranged not for companionship but for politics, alliances built not on trust but on necessity. The personal became political in a way that stripped it of all warmth. When one reads the letters and diaries of the era, one can feel the exhaustion behind the formality, the quiet despair that lived beneath the lace and the gold. And yet, for all their flaws, the Bourbons were not villains in the story of Europe. They were human beings caught inside a system too vast for anyone to control. The kings who sought absolute power were themselves bound by fear of rebellion. The princes who longed for freedom were crushed by the expectation of obedience. The system demanded perfection and punished humanity. Ferdinand's desire for peace was seen as weakness. Philippe's courage was viewed as threat. Louis Charles's innocence was treated as danger. The lesson that emerges from their stories is not only about monarchy. It is about the cost of believing that any one family, any one bloodline, can bear the weight of destiny forever. As the 19th century unfolded, the world that had once bowed to the Bourbons transformed beyond recognition. The Napoleonic Wars tore through the continent, scattering thrones like leaves in a storm. When peace returned, it was fragile, bound together by compromise rather than conviction. The Congress of Vienna restored Bourbon kings to France, Spain, and Naples, but they ruled over nations forever changed by revolution. No longer could they claim to govern by divine right alone. The people had tasted freedom, however fleeting, and the memory of it could not be erased. In France, Louis XVIII and Charles X learned this truth the hard way. Each tried to balance tradition with reform, but both were undone by the same arrogance that had haunted their ancestors. Even restoration could not revive the illusion of permanence. The Bourbon legacy thus became not a story of triumph, but a cautionary tale. Across Europe, rulers watched and listened. Some learned to adapt, sharing power with parliaments and constitutions. Others clung to the old ways until revolution swept them aside. The labyrinth of history does not forgive repetition. Those who refuse to change find themselves walking in circles until the walls close in. For the Bourbons, the pattern was inescapable. The more they sought control, the more control slipped from their grasp. They tried to shape destiny through marriage, diplomacy, and blood, but destiny, like history, belongs to no one. What remains remarkable about the Bourbon story is how deeply it influenced the world that followed. Their reign gave birth not only to revolutions, but to ideas that reshaped civilization, citizenship, equality, and the questioning of authority. Even their failures taught lessons that outlived them. The fall of the Sun King's descendants showed that no empire, however grand, can survive without the consent of the governed. Their exile revealed that nobility is not a shield against change. The very name that once symbolized divine order became a reminder of human fragility. Through their suffering, Europe learned to replace reverence with reason, and the people learned that power could be challenged. The lost lives of the Bourbons also changed how we remember history itself. For centuries, history was written by and for kings. Their victories filled the chronicles, their portraits lined the halls of learning. But the silent figures, the brothers who were overshadowed, the children who were erased, the wives who were silenced, began to emerge from the margins. In them, historians found the truth of how power really works. The story of Philippe is not merely about court intrigue. It is about what happens when individuality is sacrificed to hierarchy. The story of Louis Charles is not only a tragedy of innocence, it is a symbol of how fear turns even the purest into victims. The story of Ferdinand is not simply political misfortune. It is the quiet suffocation of conscience beneath duty. Together, they reveal that history is never just a tale of rulers, but of the human cost that power demands. To walk through the ruins of their world today is to feel the echoes of their choices. The palaces of France and Italy still stand, Versailles, Fontainebleau, Caserta, Parma, each a monument to ambition and excess. The ceilings glitter with gold leaf, the halls stretch endlessly, the gardens bloom in perfect symmetry. But beneath the beauty lies a kind of silence, a stillness that speaks of loss. Every stone, every mirror, every corridor seems to remember those who walked them and never returned. It is the silence of forgotten voices, the whispers of treason that ended lives, the cries of children lost to politics, the sighs of exiled princes watching the world move on without them. Their absence is the true inheritance of the Bourbons. If there is a lesson in their story, it lies in the understanding that power is never eternal, and neither is glory. What endures are the choices made when power begins to fade. Some fought to the end, believing in a divine right that had already turned to dust. Others accepted exile and tried to live as ordinary men, though the world would never let them forget their crowns. And some, like Ferdinand, tried to govern with humility, only to be undone by the arrogance of others. The labyrinth offers no easy escape, only reflection. For those who study it, the question is not how they fell, but whether we have truly learned from their fall. The Forgotten Bourbons remind us that history's greatest truths often hide in its quiet corners. The names carved on monuments tell only half the story. The rest lies in the shadows, in the letters never sent, the alliances never fulfilled, the lives that ended not with rebellion but with resignation. Their struggles mirror our own, though our crowns are invisible. We all walk the same corridors of ambition, fear, and compromise, searching for meaning in a world that prizes control. The Bourbons' downfall is not just a royal story. It is a human one, repeating in boardrooms, governments, and families wherever power becomes a substitute for understanding. The labyrinth still exists today, though its walls have changed shape. It lives in the structures we build, the hierarchies we preserve, the illusions we maintain about who holds control. The Bourbons walked through it believing they could master its paths, but the labyrinth has no master. It humbles all who enter. Their legacy warns us that authority without empathy breeds decay, and ambition without wisdom leads only to loss. Each forgotten prince, each silenced queen, each vanished heir is a voice whispering across time, that the pursuit of dominance often ends in disappearance. In reflecting on their stories, we are invited to see ourselves more clearly. Power, whether royal or ordinary, always tests character. It tempts, isolates, and reveals. The Bourbons failed not because they were unworthy, but because they were human, bound by pride, fear, and the longing to be remembered. Their legacy, then, is not just the palaces they built or the wars they fought, but the caution they leave behind. The labyrinth of history is never empty. It waits for each generation to enter and find its own way through. Whether we repeat their mistakes or learn from them depends on how willing we are to see beyond the glitter to the cost beneath. Their tragedies endure not because of their titles, but because of what they reveal about all power. That it is fleeting, fragile, and never without consequence. In the lives of Philippe, Louis Charles, and Ferdinand, we see the arc of history itself, a rise, a fall, and the long shadow that follows. They remind us that even in loss, there is meaning, and even in obscurity, there is truth. The Bourbons may have ruled the world once, but their true legacy lies in what they teach us now. That no crown can protect against time, and no lineage can outlast the human need for freedom. As we look back on the labyrinth they left behind, it becomes more than a story of kings and courts. It becomes a mirror held up to every age that believes itself invincible. Their world was gilded, ours is digital, yet the questions remain the same. What does power demand of those who hold it? What happens to those who stand too near its light? And how many more must be forgotten before we understand that greatness, without compassion, leads only to shadow? The Bourbons' ghosts still linger, in the quiet corners of Versailles, in the archives of Parma, in the faded letters of a child who never grew up. Their whispers ask not for pity, but for remembrance. They ask that we learn. So as their story closes, the invitation is simple. Look again at the lives history leaves behind. Speak their names. Question the myths. And ask yourself what you would do if the crown you wore was both your blessing and your curse. History does not belong only to those who ruled, but to those who were ruled by it. The Bourbons remind us that behind every symbol of power lies a human being, and behind every tragedy lies a lesson waiting to be seen. Their labyrinth may have claimed them, but their stories remain a map, for all who wish to understand how easily light can turn to shadow when power forgets its purpose. So to you listening now, think of these forgotten figures, of Philippe, whose loyalty was his undoing, of Louis Charles, whose innocence became his sentence, of Ferdinand, whose faith could not save him from the weight of his name. Their voices still echo across centuries, warning and pleading, reminding us that no throne stands forever. Perhaps the truest way to honor them is not with marble or gold, but with understanding, with the willingness to remember that behind every crown beats a heart that once hoped, feared, and loved like any other. What do you think their stories tell us about the nature of power? Were they victims of their time, or of something deeper, something that still lives in us today? Share your thoughts, your reflections, your questions. The labyrinth of history is vast, and every voice that enters helps light the way.